Why I've put this image up is because I want you to think about the marine environment and what it's like for animals, particularly fish. My talk is going to be solely on fish, but animals in that environment. And there's three really big issues for them. One is, how do they find food? Two is, how do they avoid being food? And the third one is how they find a mate. Now I'm going to talk about the first two, which is how they find food and how they avoid being eaten by other things. So a lot of this talk is about adaptations in fish that help them find food and avoid being eaten by other predators. So think about this marine environment. It's a three-dimensional environment, and if you're lucky and you're a fish, you've got somewhere to hide. But for a lot of, hang on, I've just got to figure out how to, oh yes, here we go. No, that one, okay. Yeah, I think this one particularly, yeah. It's actually the spotlights. The spotlights are the problem. So if you've got somewhere to hide from a predator like this, you're okay. And where there's reef structure, it makes it easy. But if you've got nowhere to hide and there's reef predators around, you're surrounded by water in all three dimensions. So think about how you can avoid being eaten in this environment, and also how do you find food. In an environment like this, food is actually very rare. Oceans really are a desert for food. And so there's all these adaptations that fish have developed over many millions of years to help them both find food and avoid being eaten or finding somewhere to hide. So I'm going to go through some of these. I'll pull out some of these specimens where I can use this amazing little device called a visualizer, and I can show you some of the features. But in a lot of cases, I'll just show you jars or a photo. Okay? So first of all, the first thing you can do is actually leave the ocean. Not many fish have developed this ability to do that. These are flying fish, of course. A lot of you have heard about these. They don't really fly. They actually swim really hard with their tail fin, push themselves out of the water, and then propel themselves along the surface of the water and then glide along the surface. And these fish, with the right conditions with the sea and also the wind, can actually fly or glide for about 100 to 200 metres or more. They just sort of sit above the surface of the water and then they duck in. So if they're being chased by a predator from underneath, they just zip out, scoot over the surface, and it lands somewhere else, and the predator's going, what happened to that fish? Okay, so that's a nice strategy. And amazingly, this is a little juvenile. It's only about that big. They develop this ability to fly or to glide at a very small stage. These guys live right near the surface of the water. They eat tiny little bits of plankton, and they're visual predators. They've got quite big eyes, and they just are using that surface layer to find their food. But when they're getting chased, they'll actually leave that surface layer. But that's a rare example where you can actually leave that three-dimensional environment. Well, you're still in a three-dimensional environment, but you actually leave the threat of the predator. These are some of the best fish that, in terms of where they live. These are the top ones, at least, are lanternfish. And why they're really abundant in the ocean, but they live in the twilight zone. Now you imagine the lights at the surface of the ocean. As you go deeper, it gets darker and darker and darker and darker. By the time you get to about 1 kilometre depth, now the oceans get to more than 10 kilometres depth, but by the time you get to 1 kilometre depth, there is no light. It's absolutely black. You can't see a thing. These fish live in the twilight zone in about 200 to 500 metres. And during the day, when the sunlight's shining, they actually go deeper, so that in that deeper, darker layer, so more twilight, and at night they come up towards the surface, and sometimes right near the surface, to feed on the tiny bits of algae, the phytoplankton. Now the phytoplankton of the ocean they're single-celled algae or plants. They produce 80% of the oxygen of the earth, so 80%. And they're near the surface, they need light. So these fish avoid predation by being deeper at night, and then come up to feed, avoid predation by being deeper during the day, and then come up to feed where the algae are in the photic zone, as it's called, within the top 200 metres during the night, when the predators can't see them. But it gets better than that. So I'll pull one out just so you can have it, so I can show you on the visualizer. What they have, now you imagine you're in this three-dimensional environment. Has anyone snorkeled or dived and they've looked up towards the surface? And it looks lighter when you look up towards the surface. Whereas when you look down, if any of you dived or even snorkeled in the deep ocean where you can't see the bottom, it just goes black. These guys have an amazing adaptation. You can sort of see it in that photo. See the little white spots along its belly? Now I'm just going to switch over to this thing. See how we go. Okay. All right. So there's the fish. I'll just zoom in. I'm not going to have to put my glasses on now. See how to work this. Okay. See how we go. Okay. Now you can see these little white spots on the belly. All right, and particularly around the tail. It's a bit hard because it's a bit, so let me dry it off a bit. It's a little bit glossy from the alcohol. But if you have a look, okay, you can see those white spots along the tail. Okay. Okay, and there's none on the top. There's just the odd one on the top. What that does is effectively camouflage the fish by generating light from its belly. So when a predator's looking up towards the surface, it can't see its silhouette as easily. Predators are really skilled at looking up to the light and seeing a silhouette of prey. Sharks are particularly good at it. For these things, they want to avoid being eaten, so their back is black, as in no light, and their belly generates light. And how they do this, these little white spots are called photophores. They're like little pockets filled with bacteria. And when they stimulate a nerve impulse on that little pocket, on the photophore, the bacteria emit light. It's quite an amazing adaptation. They actually have little bacterial colonies in these to generate light. And it's basically to break up their silhouette so they're not visible from below. It gets better than that though, because there's another group of fish that live in the same zone called the hatchet fish. Now these are pretty terrible images and I don't have any specimens for you. But you see, first of all, over here, they've become really skinny. So their silhouette or their little, what's being seen from above or below is very narrow. So they've reduced their body mass. They've become very deep-bodied as a result because they've got to build up the muscle somehow. The photophores are all in these belly here. And they're also predators. Don't forget, everything's got to be a predator as well. And their eyes are sitting on top of their head. So they sit in that twilight zone, look up, they're quite large eyes for the size of the fish, look up, looking for prey, and then avoid being seen by being very skinny and also having those same photophores in a shield pattern that makes them all pretty well invisible when viewed from below and also when viewed from above, okay, in that twilight zone. So they've built up these amazing adaptations to living in mid-water and avoid being eaten. And how big are those ones? Well, you saw how big this one is. Yeah. That's actually a pretty big myctophid. Right. These ones are they get to about that size, but a lot of them are, they're not very big. They're small fish. But they actually are, if you can imagine, there's the plants, the algae, then there's the little invertebrates that feed on those algae. This is the next tier in the trophic chain. And tunas are full of myctophids in their guts. So tunas actually go down to 200 metres or more, feed on these, because they're very abundant, feed on these, and they feed on other stuff, but their guts are usually full of these, and they actually find spawning aggregations of these myctophids. So, yes, they avoid it, but they don't avoid it completely because they actually feed the tunas as well. Okay. All right. So where did I put this? So we're going to move on to another group of fish, which you've probably all seen, and any of you who have seen Nemo will have seen something like this, which is an anglerfish. The anglerfish lives even deeper. This lives in the zone, the black zone, the dark zone, the no light zone, beyond 1,000 metres. Typically these anglerfish live from about 1,000 to 3,000 metres. Where they live, there is no light. You can see even their eye has become reduced to a tiny little speck because they don't really need to be visual predators at all. What they have is fins that are very elongate, so they can sense vibration. In terms of feeding, they've got very sharp teeth. Now I've got one here. its teeth aren't quite as big, but you can have a look at it later. After we finish the talk, we can get up and have a little look at some of these. But you can see, so this is fairly typical size too. You know, they're not big monsters, but this is a related species. There's actually quite a lot of species of these. See, and they've got what's called an elysium, which is this modified dorsal fin spine, and on the end of it they have a lure, and that also generates light. It's got a little bacterial colony in there, and remember, it's pitch black. This fish is black. Well, you know, it's actually not visible. Tiny little eyes. It's got this little lure that it dangles in front of its head. The light comes on. Another predator comes along, is attracted by this potential prey item. Because a lot of the animals do generate little bits of light, little sort of sparks of light. They come over and investigate, and it gets eaten. The point of the sharp teeth, well, obviously, is to catch its prey. But what's amazing about those teeth is they can only not bend, but they've got little muscles that stop them from flexing forward. So if prey comes in, it can't pull itself out, no matter how much it wriggles. It can only go in one direction. It can actually just go, because the teeth bend back. Does that make sense? So the fish, once they catch the fish or the crustacean or whatever it is, they're caught in the very razor-sharp teeth, and the teeth will only direct the prey down its gut. The other really neat thing about these fish is how much they can actually eat. Now, food in this no light zone is actually very rare. It's so rare that when you find something to eat, it may need to last you a year. So when they find something, they want to make sure they keep it, and that's the other reason why the teeth are designed the way they are. The other neat thing, I've seen some of these anglerfish, they see the gut's pretty floppy and sloppy, where their gut, so you see how big that is, they've swallowed a fish that's bigger than themselves, and their gut is like this, okay? And that'll take months to digest. Now, unfortunately, we don't have any specimens in our collection. I did mention mates before, and this is the only time I'm going to mention finding a mate. Anglerfish, again, mates are really rare. Now, as you know, fish need to find each other to spawn, so the sperm and the eggs mix. Finding a mate in this deep ocean is actually very difficult. There's probably a lot of chemical signalling going on to find each other. Some of these anglerfishes, not this species, but some of these anglerfishes have actually developed a mechanism where the mates, once they find each other, actually stay together. The male, if this was an anglerfish that had a male, the male would only be that big, okay? The male comes along, they find each other, say, yee-haw, we're going to be able to reproduce and spawn. The male attaches, bites into the female's skin. Her skin grows over that. His bones all fall apart and basically dissolve. All he's left with is, and he becomes basically a parasite supplied by blood from her, so her blood system integrates into his, and all he becomes is a little sack of sperm. And then when she's ready to spawn and release her eggs, she releases a chemical trigger to him, and he releases his sperm, and that's how they stay together, and they're stuck for life. Some females have 2 or 3 males attached to them. So, you know, it might be the perfect solution for some women, but anyway, it's actually a very good solution to an environment where finding a mate is actually really difficult. So that's a really neat little thing. Now, you've all heard of moray eels. This one's pretty simple and basic, actually. During the day, moray eels hide in caves and crevices, but if you ever dive on a coral reef particularly, they do come out sometimes. At least they stick their head out, but they've always got their cave to retreat to. They're also very difficult to catch for any predator because they've got quite flexible, tough skin that's a bit sloppy. You know, sometimes you see a puppy with quite floppy skin. It's the same sort of thing that you grab it, but it sort of slips away, and they can tie themselves in a knot and pull themselves out. So that's how they avoid predation, but they actually hunt at night. And you've heard of morays having razor-sharp teeth. They're not particularly aggressive. They look very aggressive, particularly when they come out of a cave like this. You'd be very unlucky to be bitten, but people sometimes try to feed them, and then they'll latch onto their hand, and they actually lacerate their hands really badly. So obviously these guys have very sharp teeth. They hunt around at night. They've got very good sense of smell. They hunt around at night in caves for other fish. They latch onto the fish, and there's their meal. Okay. I'm going to talk to you about a group of fishes called the scorpionfishes. A lot of fish have spines that stick up, but very few fish actually have poisonous spines. And you've thought of stingrays as well, and they've got a spine as well. It's very rare for fish to actually develop toxins in their spines, except in this group. This is a group of scorpionfishes. They've got very well developed on the back, the dorsal fin spines, that have at the base of the spines small toxic pouches. And so if you step on one of these, particularly if you grab one of these, the spine actually has a groove up its back, and so you step on it, put pressure on the spine, it compresses the pouch, and the toxin comes up the groove, and if you've got a puncture wound, the toxin goes into your body. Now that is definitely a defence system. These guys usually are lie in wait ambush predators. They sit on the bottom, and they just sit and wait for something to swim past, and they just lunge at it and open their cavernous mouth, and they just suck in whatever's there. Well, I'm getting to the stonefish. The stonefish is the most toxic of the group. But I'm just going to, before I do that, I'm just going to tell you, okay, here it is, about the lionfish, which we can flick to. I hope there's an image there. Some of these images are from the Kermidex, and some of these fish are too. Not these deep sea ones, but this one particularly. Okay, the lionfish has sort of exaggerated its spines and quite happily parades around the reefs and sort of says, here I am, and opens its fins up. Very colourful, very flashy. Again, the only fins that are actually poisonous are actually the dorsal spines, but you know, when you're walking around with big spines like this, you're sort of saying, back off, because I've got very poisonous spines. And these are quite toxic. Once they're preserved, they're okay, thank goodness. But getting one of these spines jab you is actually very painful. And the only treatment, well, one way when you're out at sea, if you ever get jabbed by one of these, the best treatment is water as hot as you can bear it, because the toxin is actually a protein. So if you cook the protein, like boiling an egg, it actually changes its nature, and it's no longer a liquid, it solidifies and breaks down the protein. So that's sort of the lionfish is no longer a lion weight predator. It actually swims around. It has a very cavernous mouth as well. It eats other fish and small crustaceans, and it just sucks them in. But it is now advertising the fact that it's very toxic. The next one is the most toxic of the group, the stonefish. This is you won't see it in New Zealand, luckily, but people step on this stonefish because they live in among shallow reef and muddy habitats, and if you're unlucky enough to step on one of these spines, their toxin is actually quite lethal to humans. At the very least, it'll make you very sick, paralysis, but if you don't get treated and get treated for it, it actually will kill you as well. And I actually had a friend who and he was unfortunately a paraplegic, so he was crawling on his hands, and he actually got jabbed all through here, and he ended up in hospital for a week, just from that couple of little jab marks, just tiny little puncture wounds, and that's all you see, but excruciatingly painful. I've been stung by some of these, not of stonefish, but some of these scorpionfish relatives, and it's sort of like giving yourself a cut, rubbing salt and vinegar into it. It's just hot and burns, and it's really, really painful. So you know you're stung by one, but you need treatment straight away. But you can see the spines aren't particularly big, but the toxin really packs a punch. So again, another lion weight predator just sits on the bottom, waits for something to go by, and just... And if you're a fish and you open your mouth really quickly, it actually causes like a vacuum. So something swimming near the mouth will actually get sucked in as soon as the mouth's open. So it just gets sucked in by the negative pressure that the mouth is forming. And you see the mouth is even pointing up, and it's quite camouflaged in the environment it's in, sort of this rocky, sort of sandy habitat. Okay? Now, this is something that we caught on the Kermidex, and it's a soapfish. I won't bother getting it out, but that's how big it is. There's some soapfish there. These guys just scoot around the reef. They feed on plankton, a very big mouth again, so that they use that sucking mechanism that I was just talking about. These guys are very bright, blue and yellow, very obvious in the environment they live in, and they're also advertising themselves. A lot of fish do this. If they're toxic in any way, they'll actually advertise the fact and fish know, oh, I know that blue and yellow fish, I'm not going to eat that guy because it either tastes awful or is toxic. What these guys produce is a mucus on their skin. Okay, the soapfish, it's called a soapfish because when you catch them, they're quite slimy and soapy. And in the 50s, a fish biologist called Jack Randall actually discovered the nature of this fish in this group of fish. He'd collected a new species. He saw this sort of fish, this sort of groper-looking fish, and thought, oh, this is a new species. So he grabbed it and had nowhere to put it, so he just stuck it in his togs. And he got back to the boat and pulled it out, and there's all this slime in his togs, and he broke out in this excruciatingly painful raw rash that, again, no one knew what it was or how to treat it. And the scientific paper that describes the new species also goes into a lot of detail about the pain and how he ended up catching it, and also the soap that's produced, and it's an irritant. Now, that's obviously an irritant to people, but it's also an irritant to a predator. It's slippery, so it's hard to catch, but that slime is actually really disgusting. It tastes really disgusting, and so these fish actually telling everyone, if you bite me, you're going to get a really bad package, so don't come near me. So they actually advertise the fact that they're quite toxic. This is yellow and red. You know, it's really any contrasting colours typically is a warning sign. So any strongly contrasting colours.
So what does eat soapfish? It doesn't mind.
Probably not much. Probably sharks do, but I don't. You know, maybe they just sort of gulp them down. And does anyone ever use that stuff on their fingernails that tastes awful? You eventually get used to it. so maybe some of these sharks actually start getting used to it after a while. Now, there's not many. All right. Next, I'm going to talk about pufferfish, so you can have a look at this. You can actually handle this one. Don't squeeze it because it's quite sharp, but I'll know when you squeeze it. But pufferfish, they've got parrot-like beaks. They actually come along and grind surface layers and feed on algae, or they actually break shells. Okay. Now, as you can see, that's not how the fish looks like all the time, but when it's threatened, it actually blows itself up. And it uses two mechanisms. It fills itself up with water and air. I don't know if anyone's ever caught a pufferfish, seen it blown up and thrown it back in the water, and it actually floats on the surface. They've got a swim bladder. A lot of fish have swim bladders that help them regulate their depth. But pufferfish have an extremely large swim bladder. That's one from a pufferfish. It's hollow. And they can actually pump air into it very, very quickly. And then inflate themselves up into this large ball. And when they do that, they've got these spines. So I'm just going to put one of these under the visualiser. So, yeah. Wow, that's like it's drawn. Okay. All you see of a pufferfish... Hey! I told you not to squeeze it. You had to do that, didn't you? Okay, all you see of the pufferfish spine is this little bit there, okay? All the rest of it, and you can see how much of it there is actually embedded in its body. So when it puffs itself up, what it does, normally this, when it's swimming along normally, that sits like that, but when it puffs itself up, it actually causes the spine to come up, stick out, like that, okay? So it sticks itself out like that. Now, that makes it very unpalatable, but pufferfish have another weapon in their sort of defence armoury, and that is a toxin called tetrodotoxin. For those of you who've heard of fugu in Japan, and there's fugu chefs who do 4 years of training to feed you a related group of fishes. This is not fugu. Fugu is a related group of fishes. Their organs, and particularly their liver, are highly toxic with a toxin called tetrodotoxin, for which there is no antidote. And the effect of it is, in mild doses, it actually just makes you feel a bit drunk and that's why I think they do it. They sort of drink a lot of beer or sake and then eat this pufferfish and your lips go numb and you feel a little bit groggy. But if you overdo it, you actually go into a paralysis, your organs shut down, your heart stops beating, and subsequently death if you've had enough. So these chefs are actually highly trained, and you can have a 10-course meal at these fugu restaurants, and each course has got fugu in it. And depending on how many, you have to decide how many courses you're having first, because they have to measure how much of this toxin they give you. And so these chefs are highly skilled in making sure they are only cutting the meat, the muscle part of the fish, and not the liver, because the livers are highly toxic. But they just want a little, just a little bit, just to give you that little tingle and effect. Tetrodotoxin, if you have a dose, if people actually catch these on the beach and decide to eat it, is quite lethal. And there have been instances where people have actually died and killed whole families with a pufferfish. And a small pufferfish like this would have enough tetrodotoxin to kill about 4 adult humans. So it's extremely toxic. So they've developed another mechanism to do it. And those of you who remember the sea slugs that were washing up on Auckland beaches around winter, last winter and the winter before, have the same toxin. They're not getting it from this, but they have actually got the same toxin, and the dogs just mouthing it were being killed by this. So you don't need a lot of it. Now I just want to show you something that we've got in our collection, which is just astounding, is use of this defensive device, and I've purposely, you can't see it yet, but I've purposely made it a bit of a secret. And I even need gloves, so, but when you've got such great armoury and defence mechanisms, why not use it for another purpose? This is a helmet. I'd love to put it on, but I'm not allowed. But this is a helmet used by a warrior from Kiribati, okay? Now, I don't really know how effective it'd be. I think it's more show than anything, because I reckon it'd be pretty easy to knock this off pretty quickly. But that's how big these pufferfish can actually get too. And so this is just the skin. Obviously, you can see it's all woven matte inside, and they've just basically put a lining inside and bloated the skin, and it fits very nicely on your head when you go out fighting your enemy. Anyway, what do you think of that? Anyway, I'll leave that out. You can have a look at that later. So I've been through the pufferfish story, and now I'm going to talk to you about sawfish. Now, sawfish are actually related to stingrays, sort of somewhere between stingrays and sharks. They're actually saw sharks. And a lot of you may have seen these. They're getting very rare now, but historically they were quite abundant, these saw sharks, and they were sold as tourist curios, etc., but also have been fashioned into weapons. Now, the saw shark has its mouth is under, well, sort of under there. You can imagine between its eyes. So this rostrum, as it's called, sticks way out in front of its mouth. And what it uses it for, it lives in usually estuaries, muddy habitats like this, and it basically shuffles through the mud and disturbs potential prey. And then when prey actually move out of the mud, or they've got very good sense of vibration sensors around their mouth, possibly even on their rostrum when they've got skin. And they basically can sense the vibration of something, and then they'll eat it, just like a stingray would. But also, obviously, used for defence, to defend themselves against predators.
Is it bone, or is it like a calcium? Or?
No, well, sharks don't actually have bone, but this isn't true bone like we have, but there is calcium. It's interesting. It does have calcium in it, but it's not integrated into the matrix like true bone. So it's technically not bone, but it's as hard as bone, It's quite hard. Cartilage. Cartilaginous, yep, it's cartilaginous. And all fish have cartilage, but most bony fishes have almost all bone. Now, this is a swordfish as opposed to a sawfish. And these things are incredibly athletic, fast predators of the open ocean. And these guys go fairly deep as well. And you wonder, what is this for? I mean, it's obviously could be used as a defence mechanism, but it's probably not likely to do that. And it wasn't until relatively recently, I'm talking a few decades, how they understood how this worked. So the mouth sits under here. So there's its sort of head. I don't have a picture of one, sorry. There's its head, and its mouth is under here. So there's a long way. If there's a prey, this is sort of the pre-warning of, here I come, but they come out of nowhere. They come very, very hard and fast, and they come scooting towards their prey. And again, remember, these things mostly eat fish that are about that big, but sometimes bigger. And they just come scooting along. There are instances where they spear their prey if it's particularly big, and occasionally they spear boats, and they get stuck in the boat. But not in a metal one, obviously, but a timber boat, a timber hull. But actually, how it works is that it actually it disorients the prey, because the prey sees this long, skinny thing turn up, and it actually, so the skill, you see how it curves up a bit? The skill for the swordfish is actually to be at a particular distance and height from the prey, so the prey actually ducks down and the sawfish actually beats it. So this actually sort of guides the prey down into a zone where the swordfish can actually eat it, okay, in towards its mouth. There may be some hydrodynamic advantages to this. I don't know if it really does make it go faster, but they swim very fast, and they are one of the most. They just come out of nowhere and sort of attack prey, and sort of usually you don't even know they're there, and then bang. I'm not talking about people, but fish.
It reminds me of the narwhal with its unicorn.
So like thing, and it possibly has a similar function. The narwhal has the tooth that sort of grows out a long way ahead, and it may have a similar function in terms of being the distraction of the prey before they actually see the bulk of the fish, and they sort of feel, and so this doesn't generate any vibration, but it's a visual cue, and that the prey would sort of duck below it and sort of towards its mouth. Yeah, I know, you'd have to shake it off. yeah. Because when you come up and have a look at it, it's actually got tiny little teeth. Now, of course, the top predator of the ocean is the shark. So shark jaws are actually, well, this is also how it eats and how it avoids predators. So without its jaws and teeth, actually sharks are useless. They've got actually no ability to feed or to avoid predation except to swim. So this is a shark that was caught from the Bay of Islands. It's related to the dusky shark. It only is a seasonal shark. But when you come up close, I won't put it on the visualiser, but a lot of sharks have, not all of them do, but have serrated teeth, and it depends on what they feed on. The serrated teeth, when the shark eats and wrestles with its prey, actually cut, just like a steak knife cuts. Some sharks have just pointy teeth, which just grab the fish and then pull it, basically squeeze it to death and then pull it in towards its mouth. These guys actually cut bits of flesh off, which tells you that they usually eat prey that are too big to fit into their mouth. So they've got to cut it into pieces. The other neat thing about sharks, okay, so if the tooth breaks off, eventually you lose your teeth. That's no good for a shark because it's the only means of it they can eat and avoid predators, is it actually has rows of teeth, unlike us, which only have 2 teeth. Generally, the children's teeth and juvenile teeth then that fall out and are replaced by adult teeth. Sharks have pretty well an unlimited supply of teeth. Usually at any one time they've got 7 rows lined up. So if this tooth falls off, you can see there's another tooth there ready to grow forward and basically come up in the front line. And they basically just keep replacing the teeth as they either get worn or if they just break off and fall off over time. So it's a neat means, because obviously some of the things they eat are quite big. These teeth will slough off quite easily. They need something to replace it. So sharks have developed a means, they've been around for a lot longer than any of these fish that I've been talking about so far, and they've developed a means of actually replacing those teeth and not reducing their ability to feed. And as they grow, the teeth get bigger too. In a juvenile shark with a mouth that big, that has the same number of teeth, but they're smaller, and as they get bigger, the teeth get bigger and bigger. So you can estimate the size of some sharks if you know roughly where the tooth has come from. You can estimate the size of the shark, and they do that. Some fish like parrotfish in the tropics around coral reefs, they actually build themselves a little cocoon, a mucus cocoon, find a little hidey spot, nice quiet place, and just put themselves, it's like a little blanket, put themselves to sleep. A lot of these pelagic sharks can't sleep. They have to keep swimming or else they sink. Sharks and swordfish and all these. But they can bask and slow down for periods of time. They rest in some way, but not all sleep. Then there's other fish that only are active during the night and they rest during the day. Then it's not that they lie down and sleep, but they hang in a cave or something. So yes, they're active, and it's more like an active phase and a passive period of time that they have. Yep.
The sawfish, you're saying they use their saw on the bottom. Is it the ocean or is it more shallow water?
Usually shallow water, and that's why they've actually been quite prone to being caught by anglers because they're actually usually in estuaries or very shallow coastal waters. They're not a deep sea fish.
But we don't have those.
No, there's never been any records of these in New Zealand. Fiji, yes, and Australia, and that's about as far east as they come. And big estuaries, I think, as well. Yeah, and warm water. They're tropical. They're a tropical fish as well. Yeah. I don't know if any of you, some of you older folk might have remember Zane Grey. He was an author of adventure stories, particularly in the 50s and 60s. This shark was caught by Zane Grey. And this is all we have of it, just the jaws. And we use the teeth to identify it. Okay, so the tooth shape and the amount of serration, etc., and its proportions are all important characters, and every shark has slightly different variations on it. So you can usually determine the species of shark from its jaws. And that's part of when we did the shark necropsy about 4 summers ago. The only part of the shark we kept were jaws. We took a lot of measurements and recorded all that, but actually we only kept the jaws. We took a lot of photos of its fins, but yes, because the jaws are the diagnostic characters. Okay, so here we have a top predator swimming around. The fins, its tail fin is actually its propulsion. It actually moves it through the water. These other fins are glides. Okay, so they actually, help direct it, help it turn, help its elevation. So those, particularly the pectoral fins, are really important for that. And same with the top fin. It's a bit like the tail fin of a plane. You need that just to stabilise the shape as you're swimming. As soon as you fin a shark, it can't swim, and even if you leave the tail fin, it'll just spiral. It can't actually control it. Okay, so the shark's out of the picture. The problem is that the sharks are the top predators in the environment, and it's a bit like African savannas not having lions. If you don't have lions to control all the herbivores or all the other, like the elephants and the wildebeest, etc., they explode in numbers and they devastate the environment. So similarly, with sharks, they are actually the top predators and they control the numbers of all the other animals that are in that environment. So they do play a very important role. And what's happening is that for a lot of reefs around the world, is where shark finning is happening, is that you see most fish are only that big. You don't see any top predators anymore. All the big fish are fished out. And it's really changing the dynamics of it. It's a bit like comparing the Lee Goat Island Marine Reserve area, where it used to be all barren because all the sea urchins had been were sort of dominating the environment, scraping away all the seaweed, because the snapper and the crayfish had been fished out. Now that they've been left to come back, they control the urchins and the seaweed has grown back. So it has quite profound consequences on the environment, on how the environment looks.